Okay, I think we'll try and make a start. We're just trying to wait. There are a few people working their way across, so we're pausing. I think we're about ready to roll. Okay, guys, don't worry. Grab a chair. Okay, so I'm Steve Sadler. I work as a Technology Strategy Advisor for TSA. I'm also chair of something called the Technical Advisory Group, for those who are not aware of it. I'm just going to, before we introduce, we're trying to do a triple act here on 3 guidance notes. That's myself, Paul Sheed and Oliver Cox. So we'll quickly jump between those. But before we do, just a note of explanation about the Technical Advisory Group itself. That is the extract from our terms of reference. So everything we're doing is trying to look at how we improve and better service provision through the use of technology. And you'll see there are mentions in our terms of reference around helping to navigate the shift to digital, providing recommendations and guidance to TSA members on various topics. So it goes without saying that if you want the Technical Advisory Group to pick up on any particular topics, please contact me or any of the TSA guys and make that request, please. At the moment, we have 4 guidance documents on the go, 3 of which you're going to get a summary of today. The 4th one, just for completeness, for information, is around fall detection, and you'll hear more of that as we move towards Christmas. So today we're going to focus on stuff that links to communications issues. And we're going to start with Paul, to talk about IP readiness.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome to the graveyard shift. I hope you all had a nice lunch. Let's get straight to the technical stuff. So some background about this. Telecommunications networks are changing. I'm sure you've all heard the talks from Hugh earlier on today, and also last year, warning of the changes to the telephone networks, where the networks are changing from a traditional point-to-point circuit switch system to a IP-type system, a packet switch system. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means in reality for telecare in particular. The shift offers a prospect of services which are becoming more proactive, outbound type services from call centers, not just reactive telecare type services. And of course, the impact of having a digital connection in the home brings a whole new level of benefits and additional services that can be added to the mix. So not just a telecare type service, but maybe involving video or other data-rich type services feeding to and from the customer in the home. So just to explain a little bit about what it actually means, I don't know how many people in the room are from the telecare industry as such, but traditional analog alarms use audible tones to communicate their information to monitoring centers. So they're the same tones that you would hear when you press a keypad on an ordinary telephone, the usual 1, 2, 3 and star and hash, but also 4 additional tones that you don't normally see on the telephone called A, B, C, and D. And all they are communicating the information about the identity of the unit that's calling, maybe information about which peripheral device has been activated, like a smoke detector or a fall detector. And then after that information is passed in that telephone call, then a speech connection is made between the monitoring center and the user of the telecare alarm. So the issue is, as the telephone network becomes more digital, there are lots of ways to route the audio from the caller to the monitoring center. And it's being split up into packets, and those packets could follow all sorts of different routes around the world, if necessary, before being reassembled at the monitoring center end so you can hear the speech. And the issue is that some of those tones that we just talked about, used by telecare protocols, the format of those tones coming through, they can be corrupted, they can be delayed, and they can be unsuccessful in transmitting the information about the unit and the peripheral device that's been activated. So the networks are going to become more unreliable for traditional tone-based signaling. So the second driver is not just about the tones going over the telephone network, but the way you connect the alarm unit in the home is going to be different. So traditionally, your ordinary telephone line now in the home is an analog type service. There's a voltage supplied, you hear a dial tone, an ordinary telephone plugs into it. And in essence, that is a voice service. It's designed to carry voice with data being carried over the top. So where you have a broadband and an ADSL filter and a router in the home, in effect, all of that data information is being carried on top of the voice service. So this is fundamentally going to change, because now the connection in the home will not work for an ordinary telephone to plug into. It will be designed for a router to plug into, and it will be a data service with the voice over the top. So I thought I'd try and practically show this. I don't work for BT, so I'll try and summarize what their approach is going to be for their new all-IP service. At the moment, you can see that with a router, everything connects via a new router. The router would come probably through the post, delivered in the normal kind of way. Router would be plugged into the normal ADSL socket on the filter itself. And that router is likely to register itself with the local exchange to say, hey, I'm all IP now, I'm not an ordinary telephone anymore. And the exchange will automatically switch this connection to be the all IP type service. So that means that extensions fed from that telephone socket will cease to work. So any internal extensions around the house will no longer function properly. And what will be provided on the router is something called an ATA port, an analog telephone adapter port, which will simulate the telephone exchange. So you could plug a DECT phone or a Care phone into that socket on the back of the router, and in theory, it will allow it to function as a Care phone. However, the first issue I mentioned still applies, is that those tones that are being sent by the Care phone will be sent less reliably over the telephone network. So they're the two main drivers, the installation in the home and the communication of those tones. And really, digital units are the only solution. They're designed to work over IP networks, modern telephone networks. They are designed to handle data in a much faster way. So when an alarm is sent from a digital alarm, if you compare it to the speed of dialing and the speed of communicating to the monitoring center with an analog system, it's a lot faster. It may take 15 or 20 seconds for an analog Care phone to dial, to send its information with the tones, and then to have a speech link. With a digital unit, all of that data can be sent in a matter of a couple of seconds. And the other impact is that once you have a digital connection in the home, that these devices can all be online all of the time. At the moment, with analog devices, you don't know if they're going to work. You only know that they're as good as their last test call that they may have made a week ago or yesterday. With digital devices, you're able to poll all of these devices to say, hey, are you there? Are you still working? And they can respond. And you can do this at very regular intervals, every few seconds if necessary. And the other point about digital protocols is that they're already in use. They're in use around the world. Sweden's a very good example. There's probably 100,000 or more digital alarm units in use right now in Sweden. And their take-up has been driven by procurement law changes where you could no longer buy an analog telecare unit. So this kind of driver is maybe needed in this country to force us to realize that we actually do have to move to digital units. So there's a number of barriers to the take-up of digital alarms. First of all, we've got a very long-established analog industry, many decades. Some of us have been around since the start. It's probably in the mid-'80s, it really took off as a service with dispersed alarms and warden call systems. But prior to that, there were warden call and sheltered accommodation systems back in the 70s. So this has been established for a very long time. And traditionally, the analog telephone network has been very, very reliable. So there's concerns that in the UK, digital is not yet required by procurement and through tender specifications. There are security concerns from IT departments. How do I actually receive these digital communications into a monitoring center through the firewall and through all of the other issues I have to deal with as a center manager, for example? And concerned about that connection in the home. How are you physically going to install an alarm unit when there's no telephone socket to plug and it's only in the back of a router? So there are various installation concerns. Battery backup for the router, will it still function when the power is off? If the router is not in the main living area, how do you attach a Care phone elsewhere in the home? So there are all sorts of practical implications that the industry is still working its way through. And so people are asking for guidance about all of this. And this is really the point of this part of the presentation, is that as the TSA were preparing to help overcome these barriers with an IP readiness guide, It's a document, it's currently about 15 pages. I'm sure it's going to multiply by a factor of 2 or 3 over these coming weeks. And the idea is that we will publish it by the end of November so that everybody can see and read about how digital alarms work, how practical considerations, and it's to help providers of tech services to understand all the implications of procuring and operating a digital technology. It's also to assist service providers in planning for these changes. At the moment, the analog protocols still work, but increasingly unreliably. And I think that the whole industry is very sensitive to seeing more and more failures in communications as the networks go more and more digital. So we all have to put in place some kind of transition program to move to digital units to accommodate these changes. So some of the content in the IP Readiness Guide, it will talk about how analog alarms work with a description just to explain how the traditional world has functioned. How digital alarms work. There are several ways to communicate with digital alarms, especially the speech channel. That will all be explained in the guide. It will list the drivers for changing to digital, which I've briefly summarized in this presentation, and the benefits of digital alarms. There are many more benefits to moving to digital than just to accommodate the changing telephone network. The range of new digital services that could be offered are very exciting for the whole sector. And also looking at further content about considerations for choosing digital alarms. What model should I choose? How should it function? What features should it have? Failover and redundancy, how will it actually get through if the broadband connection fails in the home or the GSM SIM card fails to operate? And practical guides about installing digital alarms in the home itself. So overall, it's trying to give you a picture of digital, what it means in practice, and what it means for the alarm receiving center, cybersecurity implications, configuring firewalls, how do you set up polling to check that the devices are there and online and working. So there's lots of considerations to bring into the mix. So this document will give a glossary of terms. So we'll try and clarify some of the terminology used in this sector. And we publish it by the end of November. So I hope you're all looking forward to reading it. Thank you very much.
We'll try and take questions for all 3 speakers at the end, if you're okay with that. So please scribble down difficult questions. So you might ask from what Paul just said, what's the point of IP testing? You know, we're really saying there's an issue here to be addressed. But there is a subset to this plot, which is we've got to manage the risks. We've got 1.7 million end users out there, and they rely on their alarms day to day. And we've got to make sure they're not disenfranchised by this change. We've got a fairly rapid change to deal with here. 2025 is the end point, but we're going to see termination of sales of new normal phone lines from somewhere in the region of 2022, 2023. So things are going to really start picking up pace in the next few years. People are already starting to roll out their IP networks. So in the middle of all that, we've got an expectation to manage around how well do some of the existing technologies work, and we want to test for that. So we've been trying to build a script, and we've got access to some test facilities, and I'll try and explain it. But before we dive in to the detail, imagine the puzzle that we're facing here. If you look at all of the different combinations of network providers, if you're trying to link BT supply to a consumer, to the fact that your monitoring center might be using Virgin or TalkTalk, who knows. Take all possible combinations of communications provider, all different combinations of alarm equipment and ARC equipment, then you've got different protocol types. You find that when you do the multiplication on that, you very quickly get into millions, literally millions of tests, and we don't have the time or the resource to do that. So what this document tries to do, this second guide, is to act as a companion to the material that Paul presented and come up with a credible set of tests that address the key risks and examine whether, firstly, existing analog product continues to work, yes or no. But then the second generation, there's a part 2 to this document, which is, does the new digital stuff work well in that environment too? So the one I'm talking about today is the part 1. It's does your existing analog kit work? All we've done here is just stolen a reminder from what provoked this in the first place. There have been various events run by Ofcom and then by NICC, the standards guys. I'm not going to read through this because actually Paul has mentioned some of these already. But obviously the key points that grabbed our attention were the lack of guarantee of things happening in the voice band, including passing those audible signals that Paul was talking about. So the whole idea of DTMF tone transfer is up for grabs, and some products work better in this environment than others. We know that, which is why we want to do some testing. One of the big issues, I guess, certainly that surprised me was that probably the biggest concern from Ofcom and NICC in this is where you have boundaries. If you're trying to get from point A to point B, if you traverse multiple communications providers, one of their biggest concerns is the boundary between the two. So when you've got an interconnection between a BT piece of network and a TalkTalk piece of network, to name some, apparently you can get discontinuities in the passage of activity there. And the other big one was line pairing. Hopefully you heard Hugh from Ofcom this morning talking about their consultation. You know, they've got some pretty basic worries about just having access to 999 phone calls. You know, if your power fails in your premises, your phone relies on the router or the devices in the street and there's no power, what do? Good question, which is why they're running a consultation. Of course, we've got a similar question from an alarm perspective. So this was the stuff that was driving us. Ofcom asked that we try and coordinate, which is why we're here, talking about the guidance material. And I just want to make reference to NICC and all this. They're proving very useful. They volunteered to work with us on a joint test specification, which we're going to dive into in a minute. And I guess the scary bit about all of this is that picture. Well, scary to me because I guess I spent most of my life working just on the left-hand side. The PSTN, this time division multiplexing bit. What you've now got is this explosion of components from different telecom providers. So when you're trying to perform a test, you've got to think about how does the call route through that network, and are we going to see different behavior? So NICC are very keen that we expose those options. What you have on the screen, we'll not go through these because Paul has covered it. We've got to think in terms of, if we're designing some tests, what are the risks, what are potential failure modes that we're testing for? And you'll see the list on the screen. The issues around line pairing. The ones you might be a bit more surprised around, if you're not familiar with this IP world, is that whilst we're managing this using IP packets of data, they can get lost. These things can scatter themselves around the world to be reassembled like magic at the other end, and every now and again you can lose some, which is kind of okay. You can tolerate that and still get a good quality service, but there's a limit. You know, after a certain point, your speech breaks up in the same way that your TV picture would break up if your satellite reception wasn't very good as well. Jitter buffering, how do you buffer incoming voice to your terminal? So all these are parameters we're trying to deal with somewhere in the testing, and we're trying to make it, as we said earlier, more affordable, testable. So in the test guideline document, we've come up with categories of testing to try and break those potential millions down into a sensible set of 20 or 30 tests. And these are the categories. I'm not going to go through all of those in detail. I just want to pick one example out, probably one that's new to all of us. So in the middle of all these configurations that you can read on the screen, the network combination one is probably the one that's novel. So let's just go back to that picture, NIC's picture of the network. If you look at what we've got today, it's mainly that. You have an alarm device, and it routes the call via a BT PSTN network to a monitoring center. Okay, maybe the monitoring center is using Virgin Media, in which case you've got that picture. The problem we have is you can keep on going. When you introduce an IP alarm, it routes differently through a different BT IP network, and actually you can just keep on going and going. So the struggle we have in creating a test specification is how many of those different cases do we need to cover? What we're very keen to do is that the Technical Advisory Group was briefed that we need a common test spec. What service providers don't want is conflicting claims from different suppliers of technology to say something passes or fails. What you want to know is, has it passed or failed an agreed common test standard? So that's what we're trying to simplify the language around this. So we've been through this puzzle and come up with a subset that we believe covers the key risks. And actually, in terms of call flows, it really is those dotted red lines on the screen. So if you were to, sorry, I should say as well, if you see this picture, when you move to a full IP network, actually life's a lot easier. When we get to that point and we've migrated at some risk, we've got simple IP connectivity end to end. That looks a much simpler picture. So we're left with this puzzle. We've got to build a table little bit like this, where Individual number tests allow you to route from a product at one end to the other whilst traversing multiple providers. Now, the highlight you see on the screen there is where the alarm device and the monitoring center are both sitting on a BT network. And that's kind of a baseline test. We just make sure that works. But it's probably not the interesting one. The interesting one is when you get into this territory, alarm box in someone's house, the monitoring center, in this case, is sitting on Virgin. And they're not just BT and Virgin. At one end, you might have PS10, at the other end, IP, and vice versa, which is why you've got this multiplicity of call flows. It's different ways of working through that picture we saw earlier. But that's kind of okay. As long as we define them and test them, we know how those products are performing in each case. And you can keep on going down that list. I think we're up at something around about 40 tests so far, subject to the NICC guys checking that we've covered it adequately. Because obviously you need to add to that list TalkTalk, Sky, and other major providers. BT have been very helpful in this. They've made a digital test lab available in Martlesham. And some of the technology suppliers are already getting their hands dirty, getting down there, plugging kit in and making sure it works. It's not fully equipped yet. You don't have all the network combinations that we just referred to, but we're assured that as we head towards Christmas, we are going to get access to full IP as well as PSTN. And the tricky bit we'll be needing the support of monitoring centers to make outbound calls and check that these things work. So watch this space. I'm sure TSA will be making nice requests to everyone to try and assist with some of that testing too. But if in doubt, you can see the details on the screen there. We can get you contacts with BT if you're a supplier and you want to get down there soon. I mean, Kevin, for example, you've already been down there testing some kit, haven't you? So really, next steps. We made the point that technology suppliers are already getting their hands dirty, familiarizing, and getting ready for a spec to do this for real. What I've talked through is that part one. So it's a specification for devices which connect using voice band, that data. We know Ofcom are asking us to completely move away from that, and that's the point Paul makes. But we need to know the risks. We need to know the risks to that estate that's already out there, what works and what fails. There will be a part two, which we've started to work on, which is for IP connected devices. So data actually over IP connections, as Paul was mentioning earlier. NICC have agreed to joint working. We've got a meeting with them during November to try and arrive at a common spec. We might well get to that document by the end of November. Worst case, Christmas is where we're thinking that. And there's a meeting tomorrow with Ofcom. We're trying to stay very close to Ofcom and the other communications providers because we need their test facilities as well. What are Virgin Media going to do? What are Sky going to do? Because we need to plug the alarms in their setting too. So that's the next steps. Just to make the link to Oliver in all of this, one of the expectations, if you look at Sweden, in the event that power fails or the broadband fails, quite often you're seeking a diverse backup communication method, usually a cellular mobile. So we will also have to produce a guidance note on that topic too, which is where Oliver comes in. Questions at the end, if that's okay, please. Oliver.
Cheers. So, as Steve said, part of, in parallel really with the work that Paul's doing on the IP readiness, quite a big part of that is we're expecting so far will be mobile, whether that's backup or primary, and Steve alluded to Sweden as well, and that's quite a big test case. So there is a mobile guide being produced at the moment by the Technical Advisory Group. Between us, we're just reviewing hopefully a final draft that we can get out very soon. So I thought we'd give you a little bit of an update today as to what's in that, what you can expect, and I'll give you a few, expand on a couple of bits that are in there as well, otherwise my presentation would be very short. So we've got a section on multi-network and roaming SIMs, as you'd expect. Security, I think a lot of people seem to be asking me about security anyway, so hopefully it's a topic that shouldn't scare people too much, but hopefully it answers questions as to how secure all of this kind of stuff is, in terms of mobile at least. Significance of uptimes, it's quite good to just run through that very basic principle that I think might be quite useful for people. And different types of SIMs as well, I'll touch very briefly on, but they're just 4 other things for today. So different types of SIMs, some of you may have seen this before if I've done something somewhere else, but it's important to, if you're buying SIMs independently, I think there's 2 different strands here. You'll either buy a SIM independently to put in a product that you've bought that doesn't already have a SIM in it, or you'll be buying a product from one of the manufacturers that may already have a SIM included in it. But I think the important thing for me is that you understand in both of those scenarios what you're getting. And I'll come on to linking that into the uptimes in a minute. But one of the things is to understand that you are getting a roaming SIM that allows permanent roaming. And the main difference there is that there are very few actually that are for the specific purpose of the Internet of Things, which of course this actually, healthcare actually falls into some degree. There are plenty of SIMs out there now that just get imported from another country and of course fall under these regulations, which are basically that you or I can go on holiday to Europe, spend no more than 30 days there, and we don't get charged any extra. So what you've got to be sure of is that the SIM you've bought or the SIM that's integrated in the kit you're getting is identifiably different by the other networks. Because if you fall under this, of course, then in 9 months' time or something, which is what the GSMA, the regulatory body, max out at, that is the only time they are obliged to serve that SIM. Doesn't mean it gets switched off at 9 months or anything dramatic like that, but it's just worth being aware that at the 9-month mark, if you have a SIM that falls under these terms, that they are no longer obliged to serve it. So it's quite important. But if you've got any questions on that, Asta, let me know. But security, probably the main topic really for this in the comms industry. Again, a lot of the guys who are providing products with SIMs in, hopefully you'd have to worry about this kind of thing. They've worried about it for you, but it's good to know the right questions to ask. But the main difference here is public IP versus static private IP. So public and private is your main differentiator. Public means that you can put in the IP address, which is the address of the SIM, which in turn, of course, is the address of the device. And if it's public, anyone can access it. I or you can punch that address into an Internet Explorer window and you can get to talk to the device. The reason some people do that is it's easier. Of course, the SIM has an IP, job's a good one, that's as easy as it is. Private IP is much more difficult to set up. You have to set up a complete private network, VPNs, there's some costs associated sometimes, but what that means is that IP address is basically an internal address and cannot be spoken to from anybody outside of that internal network. So that way, we can keep your kit basically completely off the open internet and keep it in a secure VPN. Again, most of the manufacturers are already doing this. It's not, in any way to scare you, but it's just good questions to ask so you know exactly what you're getting in those products. Uptimes. This is something that I've expanded on in the guide slightly more than was there before, because I had a conversation with someone and it drew it back to the forefront. But there's a big difference in just a couple of 9s, or actually an extra 9 and a 5. So it's just worth being aware that when you're talking to somebody about availability, if you're looking at something that's 99.9%, that sounds great, but actually that's 43 minutes a month offline. If you had a 9 and a 5 on the end, it doesn't sound like it's going to be too much different, but actually that's down to 1 minute and 45 seconds a month. So those extra 9s are the hardest and most expensive to get because, of course, you're really honing your network at that point and making sure it's as absolutely rock solid as you can. But there are plenty of guys who can sell you mobile connections with a 99.6% availability. But again, if you compare 99.6 to 99.9, there's a marked difference. You're talking a couple of hours versus 43 minutes. So there's a great website online if anybody's ever quoting uptimes to you in any scenario. Actually, I find it quite useful. If you just type uptime.is, punch in the availability, it tells you the downtime that you would experience on average based on that availability. So it's just quite just worth being aware of again. And again, if you're putting a SIM in a product yourself, a lot of local authorities will have a buying agreement already. There's quite a few reasons not to put that kind of SIM in a telecare, telehealth product. The main reasons being that the SIMs you buy for your phone contract have specific terms written around them that mean that you have to you are meant to move around quite a lot. So by not moving around, you're actually in breach of your contract, and you can actually then be shoved down the priority list. So you'll find that you might have had a load of SIMs out there for a while and they've worked brilliantly, but after a certain amount of time, they stop working. Or not stop working, but the service isn't maybe as good as it was before. And you'll see this happen very slowly, and you might not be able to explain it, but it's basically a lot of the time because you've got a fixed asset that's never left that cell tower, and that cell tower thinks that SIM should be moving, it's a mobile phone, it's a whatever else. So, and of course the inverse is true of the IoT stuff. Both networks do it. obviously the previous was Vodafone. These are O2's standard business terms. So even though you've got business SIMs, they still have these terms written in to say you cannot transfer from system to system. And that is exactly what you're doing. You're sending it from a care phone to a server of some kind, wherever that is. So that is exactly what you're doing. Final draft of the mobile guide is underway. The final review, hopefully, of the tag group, there's a small group of us, should be done in the next sort of few weeks. And then we hope to have it out by the end of December. But the aim basically is to give everybody a broad understanding, to inform your decisions, and again, hopefully then be able to ask good questions of the guys you're buying product from, because they should obviously be the ones that are best placed, but at least you can verify and ratify then exactly what you're being told. So I think that was it for me.
We're back on mic. We're just going to take some questions from the floor, if we could. I think we've got a roving microphone somewhere. Oh, thank you. We've got a question way down this end, please. Sorry to drag you all the way across the hall.
Two questions, actually. Not really related, but I think both of them are quite critical. One, to me, the elephant in the room of this whole thing is that our TSA lobbying government, etc., with regard to the cost of all this, us as a small provider, sort of cigarette packet calculation at this moment in time, with the prices of new IP kit and upgrading our control centre, I estimate it would probably cost us £400,000 to £450,000 to get IP dispersed alarms and upgrade our control centre. So for a small organisation that like us, that is a killer, even if it's done over a couple of years. Because, yeah, saying up until 2025, fine, but that's the end date. People like Virgin and that are going to be by 2020, so we've got to have the infrastructure in place earlier rather than later, and most of our alarms transferred over or replaced earlier rather than later. So that's sort of on the cost side of it. And the other thing is, for mobile networks, and for the dispersed alarms, will we be having an industry-wide protocol, i.e. SCAPE, or are manufacturers developing their own protocols?
Yep, thank you. Two questions. Should we start with the escape one, clear that one?
Yeah.
EN 5134.
I think from what I can see of the industry seems to be consolidating onto SCAPE. It's very well established in Sweden. It's implemented by, I think, nearly every digital IP alarm manufacturer. But that's not to stop individual manufacturers deciding to overlay additional functions and do their own thing too. I don't know if that's going to happen. It always has historically with analog protocols. There's always been like that. But I think with the digital protocols, because we have a relatively good protocol, the SCAPE protocol, which is so well established, I think there's so much momentum with that I believe that will become the standard. Having said that, there is a IP protocol being developed which is based on Now IP, which is a TSA arranged protocol. We've got all the manufacturers together 6 or 7 years ago now to write Now IP, which is likely to be implemented for schemes, for warden call systems. So I suggest they're the two primary protocols that will be in use.
The TSA working group, the TAG, contributed to the SCAPE protocol, and that's been embedded in our consultation for this new, so part of the EN 5134 series, part 9, and that does actually mandate SCAPE. So, as you say, for dispersed alarms, that will be the nominated standard. But to return to your bigger, yes, absolutely the elephant in the room. I guess there's several points on that, and I'm sure my colleagues will join in, but TSA is trying to grab every opportunity to lobby to say this is a financial commercial challenge, and so somebody along the way has got to help us with that. To date, I'm not sure how many people are responding well. Nobody's sitting there with a pot of gold to say this is how it's going to work. In fact, the commentary we got from our last meeting with Ofcom was we're all getting lots of notice. This started last year. We've got 7 or 8 years to run, and a normal refresh replacement cycle should be accommodating a lot of the costs. I'm not sure. Well, I don't buy that because I know the longevity of some of this kit goes well beyond those sort of 5-7 year periods. So it really is still a problem. TSA is committed to carry on lobbying. We do try and seek that funding. But as we sit here today, I don't think, unless you guys are aware, there's no wonderful pot of gold that's out there. Maybe we need to raise the stakes with TSA and those efforts. Obviously, we're working very much on the technology front. But it does strike you that there's got to be a commercial gap there somewhere. There is one other part of the puzzle, which is we don't yet know how big the problem set is. So yes, we all want to move to a digital world, but a lot of the connected estate uses those voice band signals. Now, we know ideally we shouldn't be doing that from the advice we're getting, but we know that some of those products will work better than others. So we're hoping that we might be able to divide and conquer, or at least rephase that problem somewhat. Let's see what of your estate needs the most urgent attention, poses the greatest risks, and which can persist for a few years despite those changes. So, but we don't know the answer to that yet, which is why we need that IP test script running quickly as possible to see where the risks lie. We may get lucky, but I'm absolutely sure, because I know a lot of the older kit that's out there, some of that will undoubtedly fail in this environment. We need to know how much and where. So you've got a few things working in our favour in terms of risk management, but ultimately none of us have got access to a wonderful pot of gold yet.
The thing I think it will do is, if we're not careful, it will set back the sort of telecare sector years. Like, we always provided a free service until 18 months ago, and then finally austerity caught up with us, and we've had to introduce charges. We lost a third of our client base because they didn't feel they wanted to pay for the service. Yeah. And I think, if we're going to have to increase our charges to cover the costs, then I think we're going to lose even more clients, and so the industry will contract.
So let me just play that back. It wasn't on microphone. The concern being expressed is that it could kick back the telecare industry. We might have to increase charges to cover this impact on some equipment. I think you're right. I think it's a challenge that we should raise that to much more of a commercial, strategic debate with TSA and government. And I'll certainly take that back for discussion with Alison and the team.
Just to add to that, there's another possibility of it creating a new opportunity with multiple services using digital and supportive services that are not just around telecare, that maybe current telecare centres could move into, more proactive and preventative type services. Because once there is a digital connection in the home, that opens up a whole new suite of services that could be offered. But as you know, in the UK, there is a very small private pay market. That's probably going to grow, I would guess, over the coming years. And when you're in the private pay market, then you can start to look at wrapping other services that might be completely different to telecare. It could be health and well-being, it could be games, it could be connectivity with sharing, playing chess across a whole neighbourhood. There's all sorts of things going on in other countries that we see, but don't yet happen here in the UK. So maybe we could see it as an opportunity to really enhance the services that we offer and move away just from reactive telecare.
I should know this, but in Sweden, where they've shifted completely, what happened? What was the puzzle there? How did they solve the commercial challenge of replacing the kit? Do you know?
They just accepted that all units, when they reached their end of life, which is usually 5 years for a dispersed alarm, would only be replaced with a digital unit. So they expected a 5-year program, really, to replace. They didn't have the same impact on the analog telephone protocols that we are expecting to see here in the UK, because the protocols that they use in Sweden were quite resilient, generally. And only 1 or 2 protocols in use in the Scandinavian countries compared to lots of different protocols historically here in the UK.
I believe it had government backing as well, didn't it, which I think helped. So.
There was government funding, yeah?
Yeah, I think most of it was around the procurement law. So it just forced, nobody could buy an analog unit anymore. It forced everybody, and those unit costs are typically higher for digital alarm units. So yeah, but they've reacted well, they've coped, and more than 3/4 of all of the alarms installed in Sweden are now digital. So it's been a very effective program over there.
I'm sure that's not satisfying entirely
No.
in terms of where's the money come from. Absolutely not. But
Let's all move to Sweden. That's the answer.
yeah. We'll raise the stakes with colleagues as well. See, we need some more lobbying there. Any other questions? There's one at the back and then one back down the front, please.
Hi. I was a bit disappointed that there was not much about IoT. Just as a Commissioner of Services, we're looking at IoT. We've got a LoRaWAN network. We're using it. Lots of your exhibitors are talking IoT. Where does that fit in the TSA standards?
Yep. So in the guidance, maybe I'll pass over to Paul in a minute, but in the guidance we're trying to accommodate different digital solutions, including IoT. We've got drawn here into discussing Skype and particular alarm solutions. The way it's represented in the guidance is that effectively, if you meet the digital versions of the standards we have today, it kind of pre-qualifies the system as a reliable social alarm connected solution. It doesn't preclude other digital solutions like IoT, but it pushes the responsibility back on the supplier to show that those systems are highly available, reliable, safe, interoperable. So they are in there, but the script is different. I'm conscious we didn't expose that here today. If you're interested in engaging with the guidance note and testing is on that subject, then we're happy to share the material with you. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Paul? IoT? Yeah,
I mean, IoT's been around for a number of years now, and it still doesn't quite overlap with the telecare sector. It's a big opportunity for the future. And I know a number of monitoring centres are deploying some IoT-type services, but usually they're deployed to friends and family. So often it doesn't involve a monitoring centre in the mix, and information and alerts and triggers tend to go to friends and family with apps and so on. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about that you're doing?
Yes, we are, but our backstop is our traditional call centre.
Yeah.
So that for no friends and family are around, that it will always end up. Our call centre is Riverside, but it'll always end up back there.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
just as a Commissioner of Services, what I conveniently put in any specification now is it used to be platinum TSA standard, or now it's accredited, but for it, I don't feel secure enough in knowing what the standards are that you're saying they must meet, and how do you win people like me, as well as all these other competing views, to make sure that we've got a standard that will actually keep people safe.
Yeah, okay. Let's just rewind that last piece then. What we're really saying is that we've got this long history of established standards. So if it looks and feels and smells like a social alarm, there are a set of standards around the behaviour, the connectivity, the performance of those system components. And that gives you a pre-qualification to say this will be a trusted element. But that does not preclude those other solutions like IoT. What we are saying, though, is that what you can do is you can ascribe different properties to those systems, like high availability. Oliver touched on the issue around availability just in the context of a cellular connection, but actually it applies to the system. If we want a system that's going to be trustable for life critical services, then it's got to be 99.995 or better available. And you can make similar observations about reliability, safety, maintainability, and so on. What we're saying is that because IoT and those other technologies create quite a spectrum of offerings, we're no longer in a position where we can say it must look like this, it must have a button that's 35 square millimeters and it's red. We can't prescribe design anymore, and we shouldn't want to. So what we need to do is step back to standards which say your underlying system that supports that life critical service should have the following properties, back to the availability, interoperability, and so on. And it really then is to the suppliers of those IoT components or the system architect to show how it still preserves life, how it's good enough for its intended purpose. We don't think we're in a position where we can prescribe that anymore. So they're definitely not excluded. I think I'd want to make one other observation about what you said. One of the expectations we had in our debates was that you would want that connectivity between the consumer world. You know, the idea that family members and care networks might want to pick up on IoT and other device alerts and intervene and pay a visit, make a phone call, I think is a really compelling part of the proposition. But sometimes they're not available, they're on holiday, and you need to escalate 10 or 20% of those calls to the ARC monitoring centre. I think you're absolutely right, that needs to be part of the proposition. Within our guidance though, we need to make sure that if you're raising those alerts from an IoT system, that combined system is secure. It's been penetration tested from an information security point of view. So there's a responsibility on that component of the IoT system too. So that we do have some observations on that in the document, but I must admit, as you talk through the puzzle, I'm wondering whether we've got enough coverage of IoT in there.
I think we might go back and review that section.
Yeah. If you're interested and willing to contribute to that, by the way, more than happy to share it.
Well, yes, we are going down IoT, and we're also working with our local university. And I had a meeting there last week, and the guys just, as I was literally walking out the door, said, "Oh, Anne, and we're also looking at how we can get voice through IoT." And, you know, so there's a huge, I know that there's an awful lot of good stuff going to come through in the next few years.
Yeah, I completely
and I
agree.
just felt that your presentation it wasn't there.
It certainly wasn't in the presentation. Yeah, there's more material in the documents, and you've now got us thinking maybe we've not covered it well enough, but we'll think about that one.
Certainly from a cost point of view, I'm looking at IoT technologies because the actual units are cheaper than the digital versions of the more traditional telecare.
Yep.
And it gives us better, more varied sensors. So the sensors are a lot cheaper.
Interesting. Yeah, good point. We'll review that. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, there was one down the front, wasn't there?
Lorraine Simpson, Progress Lifeline. It's to you, Paul. I'm interested in the IP readiness guide. I think it'll be a useful guide for us. I just wanted to, first of all, point of clarification. Will that include the testing results for the existing products that are out there in the market now, and whether the compatibility of them going forward, taking your point that there won't be that reliability?
The IP readiness document is more about a guidance about going forward with digital. The test specification will be applied by manufacturers, so the part that Steve talked about will be applied by the manufacturers for the traditional analog protocols, which should highlight what we think the risk will be for those different devices using those old protocols.
Okay.
And we seek to publish those results on the TSA website as soon as we get them. That's the plan.
Okay, so in terms of the guide, will you be inviting equipment providers to share their current products within that guide?
What we've done in drafting the guide is we've involved various manufacturers of products, but also communications providers. So it's quite a broad and ARCs as well. And it's quite a good representation from the industry. So their input's gone in the guide form. So we've all said that these are the kinds of things you need to look at for products, the kind of minimum feature set you need from a digital product. But there won't be a catalogue of products or any sort of listing of products within the guide. It's more of a general guidance as to what to consider yourself when you choose to buy one.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Just while we're waiting now, another question, just picking up on the mobile and cellular. In Sweden, I should know this, but when they've migrated to IP, to a large extent they've used cellular connections. Are those primary connections, or are they backup, or?
They're primary connections.
Yeah,
primary connections.
Yeah. And it's more than 90% of all the digital units are using a SIM card and a GSM service for
Rather
that.
than the broadband connection.
And the practicality of that was that they initially started with plug-in units that would plug into the port on a router or on a hub. But there were too many practical obstacles, firewall configuration, maybe it wasn't in the right location. And it was a very practical issue that providing it with a SIM and mobile and therefore could be anywhere in the home was a simple solution. And that's really why it's taken hold.
Yeah.
I think there's an issue as well about making sure that the connection is part of the product, because if you're plugging into something else that isn't part of a safety system, then the son or daughter of the person can come and say, Mum, I've got you a great broadband deal, And of course, they update the iPad and the phone password, but don't know about that thing in the corner that looks after them until they press the button and it doesn't work anymore. You know, so it's practicality things again that seem to sway towards that.
So far our big takeaways are we need to go and refresh our homework on IoT, and have we covered that well enough in the guidance, and obviously, inevitably, the budgetary issues that go with that. Any other questions before we wrap it up? So struggling to see through the lights. One more at the front.
For the roaming SIMs, because I see the obvious advantages of going down that route, as you're saying, the sort of ability to install it anywhere within the home and not worry about the IP address issues and things like that. But for ordinary sort of voice SIMs around our area, there are many really poor reception areas where no carrier works.
Yeah.
And we're sort of slap bang in the middle of Coventry, Birmingham and Leicester, you know, so we're not exactly out in the wilds.
Yeah.
With the roaming SIMs, what is the reliability like with those? Because, you know, I was just wondering what percentage of our clients perhaps would fall in the category where a mobile network unit just wouldn't work.
Yeah. It's a good question. So there's a couple of strands to that. One is that if there is no network, and by genuinely, and that by that I don't mean just isn't picked up on your phone. If there's nothing, you're in a valley and it's not there, then it's not there. But those kind of scenarios are very, well, quite rare, really. I mean, there's a lot of guys I've spoken to that have said, oh, we've got 40% failures, 30% failures, stuff like that. Those numbers are too high. Something's wrong. You know, something in the implementation is wrong. Either the hardware isn't very good at finding the signal or something like that. So there's a lot of work goes on with the telecare manufacturers of the devices and the SIM providers to make sure that what you're doing is marrying these two things together. So that the device is going, no, I can't find a signal on that network, let me try this one, let me try. Brilliant, I've got a solid network and I know that that's my good one and that's my second one. And bluntly, phones don't do that, because these days your phone might seem very smart, but of course the other thing they have to contend with is battery management. So if your phone's doing all this clever stuff, your battery will last half the day. So they have to actually turn a lot of that down, including antenna performance and things like that. There's a fine balance there, and as you will imagine, most phones literally last almost exactly a day now, and that's a very fine tweaking of making sure it lasts the day, and lots of other compromises in between. So, yeah, if that answers your question.
Okay, any last question from the audience? Just one final note, the material that's been produced by the Technical Advisory Group is completely open to TSA members. If you want to be at those advisory groups, get access to the documents, contribute, please contact me. You can get to us through any of the TSA staff. So please have a go. And I'd love to follow, I can't quite see who's at the back. I need to follow up with our colleague on IoT, maybe get some contribution into the document. Okay, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your day.